Hello and welcome to part 3 of this video series featuring IBM Voice Gateway. In this video we're going to be concentrating on the advanced orchestration at the SOE layer, and we're going to build upon the infrastructure that we set up in part 2. If you haven't done part 2 yet, you'll need to go back to the playlist and complete the steps in part 2, because what we're going to do next won't make much sense unless you've completed part 2 successfully. At the end of part 2, we'd assembled the building blocks of our solution. We had the Twilio SIP trunk, we had the voice agent on IBM Cloud, we'd implemented a simple service orchestration engine in Node-RED, and we had the 3 Watson services: text-to-speech, conversation, and speech-to-text. In part 2, we built a simple conversation service that allowed us to make inquiries about pizza. So the first thing we'll do is we'll replace that with something a little bit more complex, and this will be the life insurance example, which we saw back in part 1. Okay, so the first thing we'll do is we'll log into IBM Cloud, and from our dashboard, let's create the new conversation service. So let's open the developer tools, and here we can see the voice pizza workspace that we'd created in part 2. What we're going to do now is we're going to import a new workspace. You'll find the location of this file in the video description. So I'm just going to take it from my local machine. I'm going to import everything, and that's created the new workspace. So we've got a bunch of intents related to life insurance, get quote, hello, how much needed. We can see examples of how these intents are represented. We've then got 3 entities that we're looking to capture: the age of the customer, the cover amount that's required, and their gender, and the dialog. Now, the dialog is sufficiently complex to warrant a quick tour. So first of all, we have the welcome node, which is typically how we start the conversation. So if the system identifies welcome or hello, it will respond with this text. We've then got 3 simple question and answer nodes. The first one is how much will it cost? The second one is how much do I need? And the third one is tell me about. So let's have a look at tell me about. This will be triggered if the service identifies the tell me about life insurance intent, and it will respond with some explanatory text about what life insurance is about. Then we have a more complex node, the gather customer details node. This is triggered if the system identifies a get quote intent. This node uses the slots capability. So this has a number of slots for different attributes it's looking for. So we've got the first one, which is looking for age, second one is cover amount, and the third one is gender. So when it starts, so here we've got the text: if no slots are pre-filled, ask this first. So you'll hear the system say, before I can give you a quote and you need to know a few things about you, let's begin with your age. Then, if it can't find cover amount, it will ask how much cover do you need, or if it hasn't found the gender, it will ask you, are you male or female? Once the 3 slots have been filled in, control will jump to this deliver quote node. So if we have a look at that, deliver quote responds with this text: your quote is brackets quote, thank you for calling Watson Insurance. And it's this template text that we have the SOE looking out for. So if the SOE is scanning the results from conversation before they go into text to speech, it will substitute a quote value that it's obtained from an external system into this placeholder here. Okay, so let's update our SOE to point at that conversation service. So I'm going to go back into my cloud dashboard, open up my SOE application, and open up the flow editor. And this is how we left it at the end of part 2. It was a simple pass-through SOE. Now, this is the URL that we exposed to the voice agent. It was My Pizza SOE, and this is what we entered into the configuration of the voice agent. But it's very important to understand what's happening with this SOE. So I'm going to just drop a few comments onto the canvas. Speech to text. The reasons why I'm doing this will become clear in a moment. I'm just going to copy that. Let's call this one text to speech. Okay, so before the URL is called by the voice agent, the speech to text processing has been completed. So that's happening before this URL is triggered. It's happening before we're doing this processing. Then we're going into the conversation service. Then we've got some other opportunities to do some processing, call external services, and then when we provide the HTTP response here, control is passed over to text to speech. So that is the basic structure of every interaction. Text to speech, some processing, conversation, more processing, and then out to text to speech. Okay, so the only thing that we need to change to have our voice agent use the new conversation is change the conversation credentials in here, specifically the workspace ID. So let's go and do that now. The workspace ID will be set to whatever it was at the end of part 2 when you created the pizza conversation. So let's grab the workspace ID of the life insurance conversation we just imported and put that in here. So we get the workspace ID by clicking on these 3 dots. Here we can copy the workspace ID, paste that into the conversation node, click done and deploy. And that's our configuration switched over. We haven't had to change any of the Twilio settings or any of the voice agent settings, just the conversation used from within the SOE. Right, let's give that a call, see if it's working.
Hello, and welcome to Watson Insurance. How can I help you today? ?
Tell me about life insurance.
Life insurance works by paying a lump sum should you die unexpectedly. This money will help.
So that's working in a basic sense, and if you want to listen to a full recording of that conversation, you can find it at the end of the part 1 video. Let's call the service again, but this time we'll go straight for a quotation. Now, because we don't have a quotation service plugged in, when we ask for a quote, we'll end up hearing the template text in the response. Right, so we can follow what's going on. Let's open up the conversation dialog. Let's go into the life insurance quote. And you'll remember that when we phone in, we're going to hear this welcome message. Hello and welcome to Watson Insurance. How can I help you today? Right now we're getting that annoying question mark, so let's remove that now. One of the intents is get quote, and you can see the kind of the training examples that I've given Watson here. If I say anything like this, give me a quote, or I want life insurance, that intent will be recognized. So the get quote intent will be identified. Because of that, the dialog will switch, because we've got this gather customer details node, which is triggered when the system identifies the get quote intent. Then we're going to loop around in here while these slots are completed. It's going to be looking for a number, a currency, and a gender. And when this is completed, I just expand that, we're going to jump to deliver quote. And deliver quote responds with this text. Your quote is brackets quote. Thank you for calling. And that's what we're going to follow along on the call. Right, let's switch over to the welcome node, give that a call.
Hello, and welcome to Watson Insurance. How can I help you today?
I'd like a quotation.
Before I can give you a quote, I need to know a few things about you. Let's begin with your age.
45.
How much cover do you need?
£50,000.
Are you male or female?
Male.
Your quote is quote. Thank you for calling Watson Insurance.
Okay, let's fix that by looking out for this template text in the SOE. So back in the flow, what we're going to do is allow this to flow through if we don't find the quotation template text, but if we do, we're going to take a different route and a different way of responding. So let's rename this as a conversation response. And that's what we'll do if we don't identify the quote template text. But now we're going to put a function in here. So this function is going to allow us to interrogate the response text out of the conversation and branch if necessary. So the first thing we'll want to do is set an additional output on this so we can branch if necessary. I'll copy that conversation response and rename it to be quotation response. And then I'll connect that up. So the trick here is working out which of these branches we want to follow. Right, this is kind of quirky in Node-RED. We've got two output paths leading from this function node. So we can indicate to Node-RED as to which one of these to follow by returning an array that contains two variables, and whichever one is not null, that's the path that Node-RED will follow. So let's do that now. So I want two variables. And I want to return an array that contains both of those variables. So how are we going to decide which one of these should be null and which should be not null? Well, if we look in the debug output, we'll see a response that will give us a clue. So if we look at the output text, and this is what's come from conversation, notice it's not the last one in the debug output, but we can see we've got your quote is quote. So whenever we get any output from conversation, this is where that output ends up in our data structure. So let's store that in a new variable. Okay, so we've got a new variable called conversation output that maps to message.payload. So here's message.payload.output.text position 0. Right, let's insert the test. Okay, so we're going to test the value of this variable, and if it includes the word quote, we're going to set the quote flow variable to be the value of the message payload, which will cause us to follow down this quote flow. If it doesn't include quote, then we're going to set the conversation flow variable to be the message payload, and it will cause the system to follow this flow. Right, just before we give this a call, test it, let's do something obvious and insert, or rather override the value of the quote that's going back. So let's get that value from here. We'll set this to be something of our choosing in this function. Message.payload.output.text equals your quote is £77. Okay, let's try that. Let's deploy that and give it a call. And just clear our debug output.
Hello, and welcome to Watson Insurance. How can I help you today?
Give me a quotation.
Before I can give you a quote, I need to know a few things about you. Let's begin with your age.
45.
How much cover do you need?
£20,000.
Are you male or female?
Male.
Your quote is £77.
Great. So we're starting to get somewhere now. So let's tidy this up. Let's move this out of the way. Let's rename these functions to give them a descriptive title. So this we can call test ready to quote. And this one we'll call prepare quote request. I know that's not what we're doing right now, but there are some things that we're going to have to do to switch context so we're able to call an external system for the quote. So that's done. So what have we got to do to make this flow call an external service when it knows it's ready to quote? Well, the first thing we're going to need is an external service. Now I'm going to create that in Node-RED just now. So I'm going to import from the clipboard, and I'm going to paste in a Node-RED flow. Again, you'll find the code for this in the video description. Okay, so what's this doing? Well, it's exposing a get price URL, which will be visible on the end of the end of this URL. It's doing a split based on age. So if the age value is less than 40, it will take this route. If it's between 40 and 50, it will take the middle route. And if it's over 50, it'll take the older route. And within each of these, there is a function. If we have a look at the younger function, this is setting the quote value to be 100. And then there's a merge, and then it returns the response. So very, very simple pricing service. So I'm just going to deploy that. Now let's modify our main flow. So let's give ourselves some room. Let's update this function. So we're not going to need this code anymore. So let's get rid of that. The first thing we're going to do is store the voice gateway payload into a new variable. So we're simply copying the existing message.payload into a new VGW payload variable in the message. Then we're going to copy from the context that we've taken from conversation the various attributes from the customer. So the age, the gender, and the cover. So we're just accessing the conversation context here. Once we've done that, we'll change the payload to be that data structure, that data variable. We're not overwriting the payload as such because we've already saved the payload in this temporary variable. Next, we're going to call the external system. So we'll drop a HTTP request on here. And the URL that we're going to use, it's this one up here. So let's copy that. Change it to a post. There's the URL. And obviously on the end of that, we've got the name of the service, or rather the URL that it's exposing, which is get price. Okay. Next thing we're going to do is, after that service has returned the value of the quotation, we're going to have to process the response. So I'll need a new function code for that. Let's call that process response. Okay, so in here, we're going to retrieve the quote value from the external service, and that would have been placed in this variable called quote. We're going to restore the voice gateway payload. So we're going to read the VGW payload variable out of the message into this variable, and we're going to set the entire message payload to be the value of that variable. So essentially we're just restoring the state as it was. Now let's create a new variable, because we're going to start building the quote value. So quote, but string quote, beginning with a pound sign, and then the value of this variable here. And now let's overwrite the template text that we got from conversation. So we're going to overwrite this with the value of string quote. Okay. The final thing we need to do is just drop a JSON conversion node in there just to do any conversion of the data that we need. Let's give this a useful label. This is call get price. Okay, I'll just organize these a little bit better. And as we send the quotation response back, let's drop a debug node on there so we can see what goes back. Let's call that quote response. Let's wire that in and deploy that. I'll clear the debug. And let's give that a call. Remember, over here we're splitting on the age, so if I say I'm between 40 and 50, I should go down this middle route and my quote value will be 200. But if I say I'm a youngster, that'll be 100. Okay.
Hello, and welcome to Watson Insurance. How can I help you today?
Give me a quote.
Before I can give you a quote, I need to know a few things about you. Let's begin with your age.
42.
How much cover do you need?
£20,000.
Are you male or female?
Male.
Your quote is £200. Thank you for calling Watson Insurance.
Okay, so the external service is now wired in. And we can see the output that we've received down here. And here's the value that's come from our external service. The next thing we need to do is replace the call to our Node-RED pricing service with a call to our business rule service running up on ODM on cloud. So let's disconnect the call to get price, move that over here, and we'll add a new HTTP request. And wire that in. This is ODM quotation. Paste in the URL which I know. This is going to be using basic authentication, so I'll pass in my user credentials. Okay, I'll deploy that. Let's give that a test.
Hello, and welcome to Watson Insurance. How can I help you?
I'd like a quote.
Before I can give you a quote, I need to know a few things about you. Let's begin with your age.
45.
How much cover do you need?
£50,000.
Are you male or female?
Male.
Your quote is £68.75. Thank you for calling Watson Insurance.
Okay, so we're getting our quotation from ODM now. Down in the output we can see, here's the quote, £68.75 for a 45-year-old male wanting £50,000 worth of cover. Now, let's have a look at the ODM service. We're not going to go into detail here, but fundamentally ODM allows us to represent complex logic, such as this quotation service, without having to manage the code. This means that non-technical users can write rules, run tests and simulations, and get their updated rules deployed without any downtime. So this is the flow of logic in ODM. We come in, we initialize the output variables, we do a basic quote calculation, which is represented by this table here. Here each row of the table represents a rule that gets used depending on the age of the customer. So in my case, for the quote that I've just ran, we were using this row here, age between 41 and 50. Each £1,000 worth of cover was costing £1.25. When we've done that, we finalize the quote, and that basically applies a 10% uplift if you're male or a 0% uplift if you're female. So although ODM can manage some complex logic, this really isn't that complicated. But let's do a day in the life of an ODM project anyway. So let's go in and edit this. And I'm going to just change this value here in this row. So I'm going to change that from 1.25 to 1.35. I'll save that. Uplift for middle age. Okay, and because we're in a rules management platform, we can always go back and look at the previous versions and compare them. So here we can see the change that we've just made. And imagine if we were a business user, we'd now go off and do some testing, and we finally get to a point where we were happy with the changes that we'd made, and we'd do a deployment. So we'll just jump straight to that now. I'm going to deploy my quotation service straight onto the test server, and as soon as I click deploy, the new versions of rules have been packaged up, sent over, and been made ready to run. So any existing transactions will use the old service until the new one is ready, and we're good. So if we go back into our Node-RED flow, nothing has changed. We did get £68.75. Let's call this again and see if we get a different number.
Hello, and welcome to Watson Insurance.
Hi, I'd like a quote.
Before I can give you a quote, I need to know a few things about you. Let's begin with your age.
45.
How much cover do you need?
£50,000.
Are you male or female?
Male.
Your quote is £74.25. Thank you for calling What.
Great, so that's a day in the life of an ODM quotation service. So what's next for our SOE? One thing we haven't done is we haven't added any logging, we haven't added any instrumentation or monitoring, but this is core Node-RED stuff, and there's plenty of resources about that out there. But in terms of integrating with conversation, we might want to think about error handling. So where we process the response that's come from ODM. Let's say we didn't get a quote value, or the system was unable to quote. We might want to come in here, for example, and do a test to see if the quote value was less than 50 perhaps. And then instead of going back to the text-to-speech synthesizer, we might want to reroute back into conversation and tell Watson Conversation that we were unable to quote. So we'll overwrite the message payload with unable, just as if I'd spoken it into the phone. Then we would have to increase the number of outputs, and we could route straight back into conversation, sort of like this. I'll just copy this. We would probably relabel this to be error. Okay, so we'd come into the process response node, we'd realize that we weren't able to quote, we would fork off down here back into conversation with the intent already triggered for being unable to quote. We'd actually put unable in the text. We'd let Watson Conversation compose the response, and that's what the customer would hear at the end of the phone. Our conversation is already set up for that. So if we go back into the conversation, you might have noticed this unable to sell dialog node. That's triggered by the unable to sell intent, which is in turn triggered if Watson recognizes unable. That's exactly what we would have just put in the text output. So back in the dialog, when we get unable to sell, we're saying we are sorry, we are unable to help you today. Notice how this text is surrounded by an XML node, and this means the text-to-speech synthesizer will adopt an apologetic tone of voice. So if you want to know more about SSML, if you Google Watson SSML, this will take you into the documentation. I'll give you an overview of SSML, talk about SSML elements, which I'll come back to, and expressive SSML. So here we can see different types of sentiment being expressed. Good news, apology, uncertainty. One thing to bear in mind is not all of the Watson voices can support expressive SSML. So I'm using a British voice in my demo right now, but it's only these 3 US voices that can support expressive SSML. These services are frequently updated, but for now be aware of this limitation. Some of the SSML elements we can use, these can be quite useful. We can indicate that this is a sentence. We can introduce pauses, change the pitch. Again, this is all about making the voice sound more natural. In our example, there I'm using one of these. Here we've got a 500 millisecond pause just to break up the 2 sentences. Okay, so that's about it for the SOE. Let's just have a brief recap. We started the video series with an overview of Voice Gateway, and we demoed the life insurance conversation that we've actually used in part 3. In part 2 we did the setup on cloud, we did the Twilio setup, and we did our first SOE and got our pizza example working. In this video we've extended the SOE to call an external service to support the quotation conversation. We've used a web service in Node-RED, and we've also called a ODM decision service. Then we looked at some of the more advanced Watson capabilities for text-to-speech around the speech synthesis markup language to make our synthesized voices sound a little bit more natural. We've got some more videos planned for this series, but until then, thank you very much.